Hey everybody, welcome back to Bible Funk the Duns. Today we read Hosea chapter number 2, and it's pretty interesting, so let's get into it.
Okay, so Hosea chapter number 2. Here's what you need to know going in. So chapter 1 told us the story of Hosea marrying a woman named Gomer. Was it a good marriage? Nope. Kind of went sideways. All right, so here's what happens. God told Hosea to go marry a woman that he knew was going to betray him. And that he was going to have a relationship with this lady. He was going to love her anyway. Even though he couldn't trust her, he was not going to stop loving her. Now, just because this process unfolds like a story in chapter 1, it doesn't mean everybody understood the story. So, chapter number 2 comes along where God says, now let me tell you what all of this means. When chapter 2 begins, it says, say to your brethren, my people, and to your sisters, mercy is shown. And so what it's doing in verse number 1, it's talking about the difference between God's love. That's verse number 1. You're my people. And verse number 2, bring charges against your mother. Bring charges. So verse 2, it says, even though we love you, that you still messed up. So it addresses love in verse 1, but there is the danger that in verse number 2, you still got to talk about the sin that's going on. Now remember, in the New Testament, the verse that you should write over this whole book comes from the book of James, chapter 4, verse number 4. Here's what it says. It says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Now what that means is that it is possible for us to be in a relationship with God, but to be unfaithful and untrustworthy to God and to run off and live our lives however we want to. He doesn't stop loving us, but also He doesn't keep us from the consequences of what happens when we run off without Him. Now, notice what happens. So the beginning of chapter number 2, like verses 2 through about verse 13, talk about Israel and how they chased after idols. So like in verse number 5, for their mother played the harlot. She was unfaithful. She was untrustworthy. She ran out on her husband. He's saying, my people are like this. The people of God, the Israelites, assumed that all of the blessings they had in their lives came from their idols. So whenever you start reading through, they didn't realize, for instance, they didn't realize that all of their blessings were actually coming from God. Look in verse number 8. For she did not know, this is Israel, she did not know that I gave her her grain, her new wine, and her oil, and I multiplied her silver and gold. Well, Israel thought that they were getting all their blessings from their idols they worship. God was still blessing them even though they were living crazy lives. And here's the other side. Verse 11 says, it talks about her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths. So Israel, they were still going to church. But were they worshiping God in their daily lives? No. As a matter of fact, verse number 13 says, she decked herself with earrings and jewelry, and she went after others. Okay? So here's the deal. No matter what we look like, if we aren't walking with God, we're walking in ugliness. So he said, on the outside, y'all look like you got it all figured out. You're dolled up, you're looking pretty, you think everything's great. But on the inside, I'm telling you, there's ugliness there. The second part of this chapter, where God could get really tough, He chooses to get really loving. Now, let's stop and let's get Jackson's takeaway because it was a good one here. Go, Jackson.
Okay, so all the books of the Bible are divided into these categories. So we have the books of poetry, we have the books of law, the books of history, and the book of Hosea is found in the minor prophets.
That's right.
And so the prophets, basically prophecy is supposed to point towards the future. And so in the book of Hosea, we see this sort of relationship and this unconditional love that Hosea is supposed to have for Gomer. And that points us all the way to the New Testament and even to now, where we're like Gomer in that we always run away from God and we always mess up and make mistakes. but God continues to love us, and He continues to take care of us. And it also reminds me of the story of the prodigal son.
Good job.
Yeah, where he runs away, and then he comes to the end, and then he wants to go back home, and his father welcomes him with open arms. Where we're like the prodigal son, we're like Gomer, and God is like Hosea, and He's like that father. So I really like that parallel that I saw.
I like that. What if the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament is the New Testament version of the Old Testament story of Hosea? That Hosea is the story of a husband who won't stop loving his unfaithful wife. And in the New Testament, in the story of the prodigal son, that's the story of a father who refuses to stop loving a wayward child. They will not quit loving those who are pushing away their love with every step. And that's who God is to us. Matter of fact, I want to key in on something Jack said just a moment ago. He said that prophets often tell the future, okay? So now the second half of this chapter, go back through and circle how many times he says, I will. So in verse 14, therefore I will allure her. I'll draw her back in. This is God talking about his people. Now notice, he's not going to force his people to love him, but you know what he will do? He'll woo them. He'll draw them back in. He'll love them so much that he'll try to bring them on where they decide to come back to him. And so then verse 15, I will give her vineyards from there. Verse 17, I will. And verse 18, I will. Verse 19, I will. Verse 20, I will. So there's a lot of I wills and I will here. I'm going to tell you what, when you're reading through this, those I wills in this chapter are places where God assures through promise that he has a wonderful plan for his people. And where Hosea could have dismissed his wife and moved on and just said, man, she has done me wrong so many times, and he just go on with his life, where he could have done that, he doesn't. And where God could have just wiped his people off the map, instead he says, I will forgive you, I will bring you back, and I will actually set you up better than you were before. Not because you earned it, but because I love you that much. When we read through this story, I just, I'm reading through this story, and I'm reading like verses 21 and 22. It shall come to pass in that day that I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer with grain, with new wine, with oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. That means God sows. That means God's going to restore, replant his people. So God is going to again pour out the blessings that he's going to eventually, for a while, turn off. But he's not going to abandon his people forever. This is the story of a prodigal wife, and in the New Testament, a prodigal son, who even though the father or the husband, whatever story you're reading, has every right to just say nope, that in both cases they say, come home, I still love you. That's what this story is about. So keep reading it with those eyes and about the goodness of God. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.